Okay, have to do the usual checks. Can everyone hear me? I just need to make sure the audio's coming through. Then I can get going. I have a big bundle of questions people have asked. Someone just confirm in the chat that the audio is like coming through okay. Anyone? Cool. I'll take that. Yes, there's a sign. Alright. Hey everyone, welcome to this Q&A for my birthday. It's not technically today, it's around this time, but thank you for the birthday wishes. I'll do a few questions first, and I did actually get sent 2 presents from gifts from listeners, from listeners to the podcast. So, yeah, I'll start with a few questions that are more simple, and then once a few more people join and get listening, then I'll show you whatever I've been sent. Someone says, do I write any fiction? I've written 2 fiction books, one on the philosophy of Nick Land called A Methodology of Possession, and one on my conversion to Christianity called Be Not Afraid. So those are my 2 fiction works. I enjoy writing fiction a lot, and I want to get back to it, and pretty much like most writers that I know who even write mostly non-fiction are always you always hear this thing of like, I just want to get around to writing fiction again. So yeah, I do, and those links can be found if you just type in my name on Amazon. You'll eventually find the books. What's my favourite breed of dog? It's an Australian Shepherd. How do you make yourself a body without organs? No one knows. No Deleuzians know. And, anyone who says they know how to make themselves a body without organs, completely lying. Thanks everyone again for all the birthday wishes. I'll try, as usual, answer the questions in the chat before I go through to my list. So, would you do an episode with Eric Schmidt on Carnap? I've been looking to do an episode on Carnap for a while. Carnap is like clearly one of the most important sort of recent philosophers, and everyone goes on about him. I've read a little bit of Carnap, and I did struggle there because I'm not analytically minded, but I'm always happy to do an episode with whoever, as long as they're also up for it. When's the Althusser episode coming? I really am genuinely interested in doing an Louis Althusser episode, because those are the philosophers that interest me the most, right? That the ones that were huge, and I mean Althusser was massively huge, and I'd just completely forgotten. So I don't know if there's any Althusser scholars anymore. And if you look at like what's most popular of Althusser, it's not actually on Marx anymore. I can't remember what it is, but I'd be interested in doing that episode. Tell us everything you know about Jerry Needleman. Who's Jerry Needleman? I recognize the name. Remind me. What's the prized book of your collection behind you? The new prized book of my collection is something I got for my birthday, actually. And I need to figure out where I've actually put it, which is really bad. It's right there. The prized book of my collection, which I managed to find quite affordably, is the book which influenced Blood Meridian and has the real Judge Holden in, and it's Recollections of a Rogue by Samuel Chamberlain. And I managed to find this fairly affordably because Oxfam really don't know how to price things. So that is now actually one of the prized books of my collection. I also have, there was a Inheritance. I have a very, very early edition of T.E. Lawrence's 7 Pillars of Wisdom in 2 volumes. And outside of that, I don't have anything that, like, is an old first edition or anything like that. I don't have anything too fancy. But those would be the 2 prized books in my collection. There's another prized book that was given to me by my great uncle called The Boy in the Rabbit Skin Cap, which I'm quite fond of. Yeah. Do I support the reintroduction of the duel? I probably do. At the end of the day, if 2 fully consenting adults want to duke it out in the street or wherever, go for it. Yeah, fine. As long as there's a consensual agreement between them both, I'm pretty much fine with that. When is Bob? It's the same guy asks this every time. When is Bob Dobbs coming back on? See, I'm still just thinking this through and what angle. And I noticed recently I was listening to Bob's talk, like 6-hour talk on Finnegan's Wake. So I think that might be an interesting angle to open the McLuhan discussion and have a discussion with Bob while I'm at it. Any plans to have Paul Bishop back on anytime soon? He's great. Paul is a great guest and he's great to talk to. And me and Paul did things fairly every few months for quite a while, and it's sort of been so long since it feels like a while since I've spoken to him now. And actually I've been rereading Thus Spoke Zarathustra recently, and I found actually I'd love to do a discussion on Thus Spoke Zarathustra, simply because reading it now, after quite a long time, there's so much in there that I overlooked when I first read it when I was young, and I'd like to do a discussion on that book just because it's the book that everyone dives into with Nietzsche, and be interesting to sort of ask questions around what happens if people dive in at that point. What context are they actually missing? Why that might not be, I don't know, in a way the best place to start. Bob Dobbs is still alive. Yeah, he's still doing talks like every day on his ionandbob.blogspot.com, I think the site is. Do I have any dream guests you'd like to interview this year if the sky was the limit? So the 2 guests that are living, that in the absolute limitrophy of the realms of possibility, but 2 people who are living that I would be my ultimate dream guests would be Ted Kaczynski, but he's got cancer, he's also a terrorist, and he's in a maximum security hospital, and that's just never going to happen. And the other one would be Cormac McCarthy, but I wouldn't know what I'd even say to Cormac McCarthy, because I've watched the interviews with him, and I think there's a certain approach that I don't know what I'd even say to him. But those would be my sort of ultimate dream guests. I thought so. When you said Jerry Needleman, I thought that was who you're on about. I've read. Is it the same guy who's also called Jacob Needleman? Because I think I'm maybe thinking of the same guy or the wrong guy. But he's also written books on lost Christianity, and he wrote he edited a compilation work on the Gurdjieff work. I've read some of his stuff, and I think his work is really quite good. I've watched some interviews with him, and he seems to me to be someone who's quite developed. Someone has a question. What's the best roller coaster I've ever been on? I don't like roller coasters. I don't really do that stuff. So I've been on like some minor ones when I was younger. I just didn't enjoy it at all. Mainly because they're like the insane roller coasters, which do insane things that are new. I just had no appeal to go on them. And the only ones I've been on in the UK, you go to these old theme parks and they quite literally are like rattling to the point where you think you're going to die. It's just not something I've ever enjoyed. I don't enjoy like I have no appeal to do like a bungee jump or parachute jump or anything like that. It just does not appeal to me in the slightest. I don't really understand well, I guess if you're into, it's the whole extreme sports phenomenon seems to be a late stage symptom of modernity, where like if you abide solely by sensual pleasures and sensual hedonism, then like you have to keep ramping that up. So I wonder where this extreme sports will eventually end. Like what's the, like, do you sort of do a parachute jump while injecting heroin and eating like an amazing meal or something? Like, I don't know where that's going to end. When was my last correspondence with Nick Land? Me and Nick, it was a couple of years ago now, because it was when I was still a carpenter. We tried to record a episode on horror, and the only audio I have of it, because the internet connection was so bad, was me asking. It was around Christmas time we recorded it, and just to open it, I said if he enjoyed Christmas, and the only audio I have is Nick Land just saying I like Yule, and that's pretty much all I have. And it was meant to be questions around Kant and horror and Lovecraft, and it never happened. But hopefully when he finishes his Bitcoin book, we can have a discussion then. No one calls Joe Needham Jacob to his face. Okay, I didn't know that. Would you consider doing an episode or series on the Antichrist? Not Nietzsche's, but the actual Antichrist. I've got a couple of books. There's the recent Orthodox book that's been published on the Antichrist, which was quite good. But I don't know enough about it generally, and also I think it's one of those things that's often used by the hyper-trads to sort of, they'll just start calling everything the Antichrist, and it would be nice to do it somewhat sensibly. I wouldn't know how to go about doing that, but an episode on like the history of the notion of the Antichrist would certainly be interesting. I'll go back to my other question. Oh, actually no, now there's more people here. All right, now there's more people here. I can actually open the gifts I was sent. I cut these open, but I haven't looked, just so they're easier to do on stream. So one, this is a guy who, he sent me these as, it's I don't know what you'd even call these, like a magazine that he's producing called 7 Story Hotel. So I think this is the first 2 issues. And the back very coolly says, "Who's in control?" I think this is the second one, and it's filled with very nice images. An image there of William Burroughs. Yeah, this is amazingly produced actually, and I look forward to reading this. I think let me see. I mean, there's a couple of names I recognise, but I'm excited to read this. Thank you very much to who sent those. And the other gift is the other gift sent to me is, one second. It is 2 packets of very fancy spaghetti, which is pretty cool. I do like spaghetti. Linguine is my favorite shape of pasta, but this is very high quality pasta because you can tell by the roughness, which I believe adheres to the water better, so you get a better bite. And there is a little note. It says a gift from B. James, happy birthday. I thought you had enough books, so I decided to get you something a little bit different. Gift note included with 500 grams of spaghetti. Thank you very much. Can't go wrong with spaghetti. I probably missed a load of... Who do you prefer, Tyson Fury or Anthony Joshua? I don't care. I know nothing about either of those people. I watched a Tyson Fury fight a while ago, and I don't... The problem I have with boxing and fighting and MMA, like, unlike football or snooker, is I don't have the language or the appreciation of the sport to understand whether or not what's going on is good until like a punch is hit, and even then I wouldn't understand whether or not that was a good display or just luck. So I have the same problem with rugby as well. Is I don't really know if what's going on is well played or not, because it's so sort of strangely chaotic. Any chance of a Guénon episode? I know you said you're not sure who would be a good guest for that. Yeah, once again, I'm still trying to find a guest. I mean, recently I read a short book on René Guénon by Robin Waterfield. I think I mentioned this last time, and that was quite good. But finding once again, with a lot of these, especially with the traditionalists, especially with the traditionalists, what you'll often find is these thinkers have been taken and misconstrued and used for political biases, and then you don't want a thinker who's basically just like taking ideas from a thinker and then using them for their own sake. And that's what I don't want. I want to find someone who's really engaging with them on their own terms. You know, that's what I'm interested in. There's too much secondary and too much commentary, which is very quickly glossing over the actual ideas, which in themselves are very rich anyway, and then just using them as a springboard for their own ideas. That's my least favorite type of philosophy. What date is the true New Year? Is this like an Orthodox versus Catholic thing? I don't know. I just try, read the Sermon on the Mount and do what I can there. Did Kaczynski read anything by Jacques Ellul or Heidegger as an influence of his philosophy? Jacques Ellul's The Technological Society was one of the three main influences for Kaczynski's work. The other two being the Naked Ape by Desmond Morris, and unfortunately I can't remember the other one, so I apologise. It's a lesser-known sociologist. The problem with the Kaczynski in taking the influence from Ellul is that Ellul explicitly states that there are two sides to his work, the theology and the technological critique, and they should be taken as one, otherwise you end up with an imbalance. And Kaczynski is emphatically an example of someone who has an imbalance. I noticed there was a question a bit further up whether or not I'm still in touch with Matt Cahoon. I am still in touch with Matt. We spoke on Twitter recently, and then someone also asked any plans for another episode with Matt, with Xenogothic, and I saw that he's Narcissism in Bloom is his new book, so hopefully when that gets published I'll contact him and we can talk about that. Then how do we send you books? I have a PO box which I will post on the Twitter afterwards. I can't get it right now, but I have a PO box. Does snooker have a future? The one reason I like snooker is inherent within the rules of the game is like a sort of an essence of the sport, which basically can't be changed. Like if you change anything about snooker, you've already removed what it is. And I like the fact that, the decorum, players have to wear bow ties and waistcoats, and it's all still very traditional and nothing's changed, and it's all to do with merit. Like there's a 60-year-old who's been playing for however many years, currently professionally touring. There's also a 16-year-old, Stan Moody, who's currently touring. So the whole thing's to do with merit. There's a lot of decorum, there's a lot of respect, and it's, just played in basically silence, and it's a game of pure skill and tactics, and it's great. Whether or not it has a future, like the best player in the game, Ronnie O'Sullivan, would say that there's no good players coming through. So whether or not it has a future, I think it certainly does. I mean, it's a British staple, but I don't want to talk about snooker all night. But with that said, someone has said, what do I think makes Ronnie O'Sullivan so good? It's just the most naturally talented player who'd ever have graced the game. Like he obviously practices a lot, but that alongside innate talent. Yeah. Any considerations for having Russell Walter on? I think you did an interview on his channel a while ago. Has great content. Possibly I'll have to look into that. I don't know too much about his work. Are you impressed by what you've read about John Dee so far? I saw your tweet about him. I wonder, is there anything to be gained from reading about him or reading his work? John Dee is great to read if you want a laugh, to be honest with you. The idea of these him and Edward Kelly just literally summoning archangels. And once again, there's this curious phenomenon that you find in occultism, that they summon the angel Uriel, and he's then like, can you stop summoning me? You need Michael. So they summon the archangel Michael. This is just by their diaries. And what's one of the things that the archangel Michael tells John Dee that he needs to do? He needs to share his wife with Edward Kelly. So this happens a lot in occultism, that this archangel is he really that interested about you sharing your wife with the guy who happens to be there helping you out? That seems a bit suspicious, but yeah, there you go. Would you eat only Big Macs every day for the rest of your life, or chicken nuggies? Big Macs. I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan of a Big Mac. It's like the most satisfying. It's one of the most satisfying things. I mean, it is the It's the platonic ideal of burgers. I mean, let's be honest here. They've ground down, these sort of phenomenal detritus ideas of what a burger can be, and they've found the pure form it can't be improved upon. And that's a fact. What do you think about analytic philosophy? Is it basically a failed project? It seems to me that analytic philosophy has a pretty peculiar history in the sense that it thrives and not necessarily fails, but it thrives and then dips very quickly. So you have Frege and Russell sort of strictly doing analytic philosophy. Then you go through to Wittgenstein, who isn't actually included in some analytical reading lists now. So then you have that split immediately. And Wittgenstein, in a way, is like, is he declaring the failure of analytic philosophy just before it's got started? I don't know, but I really need to at some point get to grips with analytic philosophy, I guess. Does Britain have a future? We're looking. It's not looking good here. It's really not looking good. The housing market's terrible. We have a 4 million houses need to be built with all these constant regulations placed in by the government. Nothing's being built. Food prices are going through the roof. We're paying the most for electricity on the planet. Though, there is an optimism to this that hopefully if we're sensible about it, we can build in some buffers for when things really start to speed up. The notion of the collapse peak is that the most advanced, most progressive or advanced technologically society, something supposedly such as Sweden, will be the last to feel the problems of collapse. So these problems that are happening, ultimately we shouldn't be treating them as these momentary lapses in a continual progressive upward curve. We should begin to be talking about these as points of learning, so we can go through to the future and basically mitigate. All we should be doing right now is trying to mitigate collateral damage, just mitigate the landing for the next stage of the cycle, right? Everything's cyclic, basically. Look, you can say what you want about the Big Mac, but it's a good burger. I'll go off on a tangent here for a little bit. I've been to these burger places, right? Like gourmet, one in the UK is Gourmet Burger Kitchen, and I've been to fancy restaurants, well, not necessarily fancy, but like a proper restaurant, you could say, where there's a burger on the menu. And as far as I'm concerned, a burger by its very essence shouldn't be over like £6, maybe like $7 or $8. And then as soon as you get into that zone where they're like way more costly, it's just so much negative. You just think, what have I actually paid for to get this? And the reason I say the Big Macs are great is, they just are. It's it's proofs in the pudding. I think they're good. I mean, someone's saying there that, have I ever had a real burger? I mean, I'm from the UK, right? We name our sauces colours, right? Red and brown, right? They're not even foods anymore. They're just colours. So it may very well be that my taste has been completely destroyed over the years from living in the UK. I mean, I did say before that when I had COVID, I thought that, many years ago now, when I had COVID, I thought that I'd lost my taste, but it turns out I just live in the UK, and turns out I'd never really tasted food before. Let's see. Why does the judge hate birds? I'm assuming you are referring to Judge Holden. I don't think it's necessarily the judge hates birds. It's more likely that he is witnessing something that is alive. So you notice when Glanton first uses his gun, the only way he can actually sort of verify to himself that his gun works isn't simply firing the chamber generally, towards a target. The only way that Glanton can verify that his gun works is by ending life. That's like the only proof those guys have of any form of meaning or existence, is to end life. So he gets his gun and he blows away a cat and then like 3 chickens and a goat, right? And that's like proof enough. For the judge, I think the problem would be that, whatever exists without my knowledge exists without my consent. The bird is sort of a key example of something which is quite literally outside of his reach. Like, he can't be killing every single bird, if that's what you're referring to, at least. What are my thoughts on the possible impacts that AI will have in the future world? Will it accelerate collapse? I mean, all AI to me at the moment is looking like really the, people call it the boring dystopia. For me, there's an interesting discussion around why our first utilization of AI was to do with trucks. Let's say the first thing we used AI for was trucking, which is like one of the most complicated, chaotic, multiple inputs thing, right? It's literally a huge moving vehicle with mass risk, and then maybe you can understand why that is, but it doesn't really make sense when you think, why don't we use AI to automate banking, which is an extremely just basically simple case of numbers in, numbers out, or accountancy or something like this. So I think that when you the AI is just going to be this banal reality where more and more people who are doing middlemen jobs are just out of work, right? Like, if you can get an AI, I think law, right? So when you look at what the state of AI is at the moment, we have artificial intelligence. We don't have AGI. We don't have artificial general intelligence where it can begin to like pull intelligence into it and do its own thing. So the AI we have at the moment is basically, here's a mass of information, and it can pull that information together in a far more effective and efficient way than humans ever can. If you take a human being and you say, right, here's an entire library of legal discourse, a human being isn't going to be able to go through all of that for every single case and come up with the best possible argument. An AI will. So anything where the job is basically a set finite amount of data which has to be computed to bring about an outcome which is relevant to the internal data, that's where AI will really thrive. But anything creative where something original and new has to come out of the inputted data, that's where like we're still sort of stuck with that. I think it's just going to take away a lot of middleman jobs and people in banking, accountancy, anything to do with number. I think law might like very small scale law, like small claims courts, things like that, where people could maybe pay a subscription to go onto an artificially intelligent lawyer, and it will give him the best argument possible. Things like that. Will it accelerate collapse? Maybe. I don't know. It's a question of intelligence and whether or not the intelligence does certain things. It's difficult to see, because as soon as you're entering into discussions about AI, you're talking about an intelligence which isn't human, isn't something we can really understand. If you want a good philosophy in rigorous analytical format, try Lorenz. Okay, I'll give that a go. Thanks very much. Take the Sweden pill. I've heard it isn't too great over there. Have I ever fired a gun? Yeah, I have. I've only fired a 410 shotgun. In the UK, that's probably pretty much close to what you can be firing. And I've fired a hunting rifle, but I couldn't tell you what make or caliber or whatever. Who's the most suitable director to adapt Blood Meridian into a movie? I don't really want to see it adapted, and I do have worries that when McCarthy finally passes away, that there's going to be this sort of possible scrambling towards movie rights. And I know they've been trying to film Blood Meridian for a long time. I think ultimately, if you want a cinematic version of Blood Meridian, go watch The Revenant, and that's probably as close as we're going to come. But the director of The Revenant would probably be my top choice. Maybe the director of Dune. Their names are completely skipping me. But I don't want it filmed. I don't think I'm not necessarily going to say it's unfilmable like some people would say, but I don't like this thing where everything has to be turned into, right, Blood Meridian was written as a novel. Just enjoy the novel. If you want to go watch a Western film, then go watch a Western film. Like, I don't know, go watch Unforgiven. Go watch Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford. There's speaking of Western movies, someone has just said, well, my top 3 Western movies: Tombstone, which is like one of my top films ever, The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford, and probably Unforgiven. Those are my top 3. What are my thoughts on the announcements of more Lord of the Rings films? Well, I think the people at the moment aren't really necessarily concerned with what the thing they're watching is. It seems to me that the majority of consumption is consumption for its own sake. So the idea of Lord of the Rings films is more like, people are thinking, that'd be cool that there'll be some Lord of the Rings themed thing on in the background. And ultimately, anyone who's watched and understands how much effort and detail and interest and love was put into Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings films, it's going to be hard to ever compete with those films. So you're always going to be comparing with those films, and I think it's an uphill battle. And of course, thematically and canonically speaking, the Rings of Power was just a complete failure. It's fairly dreadful. No Country for Old Men was brilliant. No Country for Old Men, I mean, yeah, technically it's a western, but it's also a crime thriller of sorts. What are my thoughts on Dostoevsky's work? I haven't spent too much time. The only thing I've read is Notes from the Underground, and that was a long time ago, so I can't comment on it. Just don't watch movies. Watching movies is consenting to being propagandized. Well, maybe. Someone said we can't have Coppola directing Marlon Brando as the judge. I wouldn't want Marlon Brando as the judge. I would want the guy who plays in True Detective Season 1. He plays the main villain at the end. I would want that guy. I genuinely think he's perfect if we were to have the film. Right, I'll go back to the other questions that were asked from the two places I posted it. What do I think of Rosicrucianism? I still don't know all that much about Rosicrucianism. My understanding is that it's one of those things where it's like a few spiritual guys in a room were messing about at some point and took some paintings and took some Shakespeare and sort of built a thing from it. But other than that, I can't comment too much. I've got some reading planned on it very soon, though. Do I plan to continue the series on St. John of the Cross? I do plan to continue that. It was the thing is, I found that I was just, I don't know, it was a bit quite literally one-to-one what he was saying, what I was saying, almost like I was just repeating him, because St. John of the Cross is an extremely clear writer, and he doesn't repeat himself, and so I felt like, am I just literally almost reading the book at this point? So, but I do plan to. I want to finish the basic, his main writings. What's your favourite board game? I don't have one. I find board games just utterly boring. They're like painfully boring. I played Risk a bit when I was a child, and Monopoly, like everyone does, and I really have just give me absolutely nothing. Leave me completely dry. Curious as to your thoughts on the philosophy of Bitcoin after the semi-recent crypto crashes. Would an appendix on my lectures on Land's recent writings on it give any kind of disclaimer or discouragement? Well, I think the philosophy of Bitcoin, from like the Landian philosophy of Bitcoin, that doesn't necessarily change in relation to what the subjective valuation of Bitcoin is on the markets, because the actual philosophy of it as this transcendental form of value wouldn't change. But I think in a way the one of the big oversights of Bitcoin has really been how it's been marketed. But of course it hasn't been marketed by a centralized body, but it's consistently spoken about in a way where people are like, is it a currency? Is it an asset? Is it a resource? Is it, what is it? And that has caused a lot of confusion with respect to what exactly Bitcoin really is and why it's so philosophically speaking and economically speaking important. Someone said, what is it? And I know what they're asking. They said, what is it? And it is what it is. Man, that's right. What do I view as the fundamental differences between Catholicism, Protestantism, and Orthodoxy, and whether these can be or need to be reconciled? Well, so to begin with the first two, to reconcile the differences between Catholicism and Protestantism is like, in a way more difficult, because you don't just have Protestantism, you have probably literally now thousands of Protestant denominations, and so it wouldn't be a reconciliation between like just two things, it would be a reconciliation between like quite literally thousands of very minor different theological points. The major differences between Catholicism and Orthodoxy are the Filioque, which is the difference between... So, here I go. I'll probably get this wrong. Because these sort of theological things, dare I say it, I don't consider all too important for how you live your life as a Christian. But the Filioque being that for the Orthodoxy, the Spirit, proceeds from the Father... I don't know. Someone clarify it so I don't make a huge mistake. But then of course you have the Pope. Some people have argued that the Filioque argument was a matter of linguistics and has been somewhat settled. I don't know whether that's true. Even within both Orthodoxy and Catholicism, you still have loads of differing voices, and so any form of reconciliation is quite difficult in that sense. The big one would be the Pope, and who would maybe give up some of their power. Basically, who's going to do that? There you go. What do you think about digital property in the sense of NFTs and crypto, just from any perspective, really? Well, I think in a way we had what was called NFTs, where you used to buy things like, for instance, you used to buy things on Steam, and you wouldn't have the digital the digital lock, where you can only have it within that certain platform. I mean, that whole idea of actually owning a digital thing is not necessarily thing that you can then use and do what you want with. It's not necessarily a new idea. It's just to do with basic ideas of ownership. But I think it's, once again, like with many things in crypto, because it's like the wild west of economics, it just gets these things get thrown into this somewhat just this strange thresher of hypermarkets and just I don't know, blasted out into just becoming this sort of nonsense in a way. I'm reading this chat, and I also have a list of questions as well. Yeah, I know about Rob Kucher. I've spoken to him a couple of times. Am I part of a Gurdjieffian group? Can one benefit from Gurdjieff without being in a group? I'll just answer the last one. The first one at the moment is no. But I do 2 reading groups on Beelzebub's Tales every week. You can benefit from Gurdjieff without being in a group, absolutely, but it just takes a ton more effort. And most people don't have that kind of attentional focus within them. It's difficult enough to pray or meditate every day, just singularly, without going much further. Most people would never really need to go much further than the basics. Am I done with Deleuze forever? Any plans to revisit his work in the future? No, I'm not done with Deleuze. I've got an episode coming up on Deleuze and Proust, the one next week, and then actually me and Brian Counter are thinking about doing a short course on capitalism and schizophrenia, which sort of retains the excitement of that book without sort of academizing it. That tends to be what happens when people venture into capitalism and schizophrenia, is it just sort of, the potency of it sort of just dissolves, and you end up with this like, what are we left with? So yeah. So no, I'm not done with Deleuze. Am I familiar with Baudrillard's 4 stages of representation? I'm not. Sorry to say. Have you acquired or learned a skill? Well, I can interview people quite well. I can write quite well. And I did joinery for a while, and I've worked in kitchens, and I've got like a sort of a jack of all trades, master of none, to be honest with you. But if you, I see what you mean about the. So one thing I would say about this, you said, so acquired or learned a skill in relation to the podcast is about collapse. One of the things that Greer would emphasize, and one thing people need to take into context about collapse, is that a lot of the problems around it will be to do with how deep your roots are. So if you're married and have a child and have a property, that's when, in a way, you should be creating a sustainable life where you are, because it's going to be much more difficult for you to just change on the spin of a dime, right? One of the things Greer emphasizes is that the way to sort of get through and weather collapse or recessions or things like this is one's ability to be very malleable and quick to change what they're doing, and where they're working, and what it is they might have to do for work. And many people, especially within our current era, where most people are doing completely nonsense jobs, just email bullshit work. Most of those people aren't going to be too happy about suddenly having to do outside work in a field or whatever it might be. So that's what I'd say. Have I learned a skill? I know a fair amount. I did bushcraft stuff for a long time, and yeah, growing vegetables and all these kind of things. I mean, the basics. And I think you'd be surprised at just how little some people know now, unfortunately. But there you go. Any plans to write a Western? Yeah, I do actually have plans that are tangential to that. What is my... So this is from the other list. What do I view as the fundamental difference... Oh, no, sorry. Can you please discuss the degree to which mental illness and disability are relative terms? That is, they relate to one's ability or willingness to take part in the current economic system. There's a great book on mental illness called The Myth of Mental Illness by Thomas Saz. And he goes on about the differences between what happens when healthcare moves from a communal good, like it was in communist societies, where the doctor still held a certain amount of judgment or interrogation of, like, why might you have this? What are you trying to get out of? Is this real? When that moves through to an individualistic capitalist society, the patient becomes a consumer, and so it's no longer really up to the doctor to doubt anything that the patient is experiencing. They just have to fit it in. And so he sort of says, for instance, to give the clear example that Saz gives, is that if you have a cold, like a common cold, an illness, every single person everywhere in the world experiences the common cold exactly the same. So it's an illness which has these very clear, has a very clear diagnosis, prognosis, and symptoms which you can deal with. When you move over to mental illness, the peculiar thing about it, and why he sort of began to write that book, The Myth of Mental Illness, is that, well, what we might consider mental illness is suddenly going to change across religious contexts, social contexts, economic contexts. And so what you're really dealing with can't, for him, be defined as an illness, because there is an amount of relativity to it. One of my own problems with the current culture around mental illness and the almost neurotic diagnostician culture, where nothing can just be a thing. It has to be this, like, oh, you're that, or everyone gets placed in a category or a cluster or a certain ism or something like this, is that I believe that to a certain extent it reduces the experiential spectrum of human life to the point where anything outside of a certain box is then diagnosed as, and a diagnosis inherent within the notion of diagnosis is something negative. And so, someone might just have a melancholy temperament, and all of a sudden that could become a depression. Someone could be just a shy, quiet, or nervous person, and then all of a sudden they're introverted and anxious, So this notion of trying to fit people in boxes, the idea that, okay, look, maybe people don't want to be anxious, but maybe some people are just nervous, or maybe some people just don't like social situations. And I think there's a certain point where, especially schooling, of course, does this a lot, where people are trying to be pushed with almost like a hammer and nail towards a certain position. And that's my own critique of it, is that it can do quite a bit of damage there, because, I mean, in a certain degree, as long as it's not damaging your life all that much, and that's the way you experience the world, what's wrong with a melancholy temperament? Read mental illness as a metaphor. Okay, I'll put that down. Thoughts on Wagner? All I know about Wagner, I read in the intellectual biography of Friedrich Nietzsche by Julian Young. That was a long time ago. I don't have the education to appreciate classical music. I either like it or I don't, which is a very banal thing to say. But I've tried to teach myself differences, and what they're doing differently, and I just can't grasp it. I'm not very musically minded, so like to try place him in that position, I can't really do it. Thoughts on the traditionalist school, Guénon and Evola? I don't mind Guénon. Just once again, I still haven't read all that much from him, and I don't know the Hindu foundations of his work, which is really where you should begin, so I can't comment all that much. Evola, I don't think many people really even read Evola, because he's used as this like hyper right-wing reactionary figure, like the most reactionary of the reactionaries. But then when you go through to read Revolt Against the Modern World, or the majority of his works, you find dense, encyclopedic, esoteric works, which are like very, very, to be honest, not that well written and just like, yeah, dense and not enjoyable. So I don't think all that many people have actually read him all that much. With that said, Men Amongst the Ruins was quite enjoyable, and Path of Cinnabar was fairly enjoyable as well. How does your diet and exercise look nowadays? What works for you? As for diet, I try to stick to one meal a day, and then maybe a little snack. So I eat as late as I can in the day, usually about 8 p.m. now, and it's usually like it's usually just sort of what you'd consider basic meals now, like a bolognese, a meat and veg. I moved away from the all meat, but I got food intolerance test results back today, so I've got to go through that. It's quite long. It's like 60 pages long, so that's hopefully going to help with certain things. Oh, and exercise, like maybe I'll do 1 or 2 days a week where I'll just go to failure on like 20 different exercises at home, with dumbbells, pull-up bar, and rings. How do you think society should be structured on an economic, social, production, and spiritual level? I don't know. I'm very anti-authoritarian, so I don't ever really want anything where it's once again a very banal thing to say, but I don't want a society where a certain group of people are saying to another group of people, you should do this, and they have to do it. That's exactly what I don't want, really. Like, for instance, you could say, well, aren't you Catholic? Do you not want a theocracy? Well, no, because I believe in religious freedom, so I don't want... this to me is like maybe where patchwork is the most agreeable to my own sensibilities, where, those people over there, they're doing their own thing, etc., etc., etc. But then, of course, there comes the problem of, well, what about when the ideology of one patch is simply world domination or something like that, right? So you're always going to have this problem, and if you're a spiritual person, then I think the key is to find something higher, which is why Ernst Jünger's The Anarch is such a important thing, because it's not necessarily higher, but it's also something that is a little bit higher than the political but not spiritual high. Thoughts on pastoral nomadic societies versus settled agricultural societies and the philosophy that is generated from either way of life? And do you think modernity is hyper-agricultural in this sense? Well, maybe you see the rift between these two camps still, in the sense that you have this idea of people living in cities and then they suddenly want to go travelling, and then you also have this idea of people who just want to stay put. I mean, it seems to me that idea of the rural city divide or the agriculture nomadic divide is still alive and well and always will be. But I haven't got too much to say on that one. Are the classics in literature, especially the English classics, still taught in the public education system of England? So 12 or 13 years ago, when I was in school, high school, we were still taught Shakespeare. We weren't taught many other English classics. Seamus Heaney was probably the closest you'd get to another classic, but Shakespeare was there. We learnt Much Ado About Nothing. I didn't enjoy it at all. It was taught very badly. But Dickens, no, and I wouldn't want Dickens taught at that level. I mean, this is the great error of modern education, is for some reason they have this idea that if they just teach stuff which is entirely not relevant to the class or their age or what they're going through or where they live, somehow that's going to work. It's just dumb. And school is like just one of the worst things. Public schooling is genuinely one of the most awful things that currently exists. What do I think of Chiron, namely Tears and Saints? And have you ever read Thomas Merton, The Trappist Monk? I like his New Seeds of Contemplation. His New Seeds of Contemplation is my favourite book by Merton. I've read about 3 or 4 others of his, and I've read his biography, Seven Story Mountain, which is, it's fairly good. What do I think of Chiron? I love Chiron. Chiron is if I go anywhere, like if I go away for a couple of days, like I will always take a Chiron with me. I find so much hope in Chiron, oddly, because it's like, I don't find hope in philosophers. For instance, if you want to read, like if you're of a melancholic temperament, and you go read someone who's very hopeful, it tends to just make you feel worse, because you just think, well, I can't even make that leap. You're just an idiot, right? But whereas with Chiron, you feel like you're with a friend. You feel like someone who's really going through it as well. And so there's this hope of someone who sort of is there with you. That's how I always feel with Chiron. Like, and when I'm at my lowest, I pick up Chiron, and it helps more than most other things. Yeah. Do I still peat? Yeah, I still do the carrot salad, and I still do like orange juice and aspirin, and sort of the staples of peating. But I still do a lot of coffee as well. Do I read any technical books? If you give me some examples of technical books, I'd be able to answer that. Do I get outside much? How dare you? I try go. I live right near the sea, so I try go for a walk down there fairly often. But it's pretty cold at the moment. I try to get outside a fair bit, but you know, you got to work. Happy birthday! Thank you very much. Wondered if I was thinking to invite Mackenzie Walk to your podcasts. I don't know their work all that well, so I'll have to look into that. What do you think about medieval political philosophy? Which medieval philosophers do you believe deserve more attention? So medieval period, it's one of these lazy. I'm not saying you're lazy, but I'm saying it's a lazy. It's just been extremely like nonchalantly labelled, right? Say medieval, and it covers a vast span of time to the point where it's now split between like early medieval, late medieval, or something like that. So, to who you're including within that, I'm not entirely sure. But philosophers who deserve more attention are the medieval philosophers. So I would say Bruno, Pico, Ficino are the main three, like the big guys who are just incredibly interesting, overlooked, and that whole period is tends to just be like pushed away very quickly. Yeah. Do you think the age of Caesarism is coming or has already begun? I'm wondering if it began during the FDR presidency in the cathedral. Is it manifested? I don't know. Sorry to say I can't answer that one. Yeah, we also read Steinbeck in public school, and we also read who did A View from the Bridge? I can't remember now. I enjoyed that though. Can you relate personally to that Times article on Podcast Bros? User type guys who like the sound of their own voice. I didn't actually read the article. I saw the title of what was it? Something to do with dating Podcast Bros. I found it quite funny. Whether or not I like the sound of my own voice, maybe I do. Can I relate to it? I didn't read the whole article. I just saw the title and thought it was quite funny. Technical book like the one from Beetlejuice. What's the book from Beetlejuice do? Oh no, that's a different person. Technical as in mathematics or an engineering topic. A while ago I read a few books on markets when I was like studying with the Mises Institute, and I just, to be honest, a lot of those mechanical book or like technical books I just get bored. I just get bored really quickly. I want to go to higher things and more abstract topics, and they just don't really do it for me. Someone said, happy birthday, I love your podcast. The first one I ever saw was the one with Nick Land way back when, before the pandemic even started. That's one where most people start, and it's still one of the most popular ones. So back to the other questions. I'd love to hear your thoughts on gematria. Is it total conspiratorial nonsense? Is there an alternate way to read the Bible? I mean, there's plenty of ways to read the Bible. And gematria, the only gematria I really know is the Landian gematria of like digit sum reduction. Whether or not you can read the Bible through that, I mean, it tends to be that people just find this strange grammar of converting letters to numbers and just doing their own thing, and it has no real structure. People tends to want to just prove their own thing. So I don't really have any thoughts on gematria because I don't know it all that well. Can I talk about the Western education system? Your thoughts on why the curriculum is what it is? To me, the Western education system curriculum basically I would go with Illich and Gatto in the sense that there is no coherence. Like the problem with the education system is there just to program people into being able to go into a boring job and just do banal, meaningless work over and over again. And the Western education system is there simply to teach you to be able to do that. Because when you look back, you realize you haven't learned anything of use. And the whole, all the subjects really adhere to no, like, there's no coherence between them. So my thoughts on the Western education system are it's just useless. It's just there to program people to be able to just work those boring jobs, basically. Why are certain subjects in the education system chosen over possible others? Can you also discuss the rapidly declining state of higher education? Higher education just seems to not be able to keep up with things as per usual. I don't think it can really be blamed for that because everything else changes quicker than it can sort of keep up its analysis of it. I'm not sure it's necessarily declining, but we're entering into a state where the how do I put it? We're entering into a more of a meritocracy where, like, for instance, a lot of the jobs in programming, for instance, I mean, certificates don't even really matter anymore. So once you move away from the credential system of education, what use is higher education in that sense? If it can no longer actually, if the thing that it's producing, which is really this quantified check mark, no longer means anything, then what does that even mean anymore, right? Do I interact with Jung at all? I've read Jung, right? And I've read Jung, but there's so much, and I never know really where to start. And in the sense that he's like a psychoanalyst, it's sort of false. But he's like a midway between psychoanalyst and occultist, so I never really know what to do with it. Can I tell us some backstory about the Land podcast? There isn't much backstory, actually. I just messaged him very early on. Like, obviously, it was one of the third episode or whatever, and he just came on, and he was happy to do it. Favorite Greer episode is the Industrial Age, belief after the Industrial Age. That's definitely my favorite one. My top 3 Hermetics interviews would be the Ludwig Wittgenstein one with Miles Hollingworth, the Greer Industrial Age one actually would be there, and then Timothy Winter, Abdul Hakim Murad on tradition and Islam. Would they be my top 3? Just because they were very successful ones, and really, were extremely structured in the way that I want the podcast to be structured. What should we in the 21st century take away from Spengler? Well, just things that's cyclic. I mean, I always took from Spengler that things are going to rise and fall, and you have to ride the waves. And you know, you might be lucky and you'll be at the birth of something great. You might be unlucky, but it's not really luck. It's just how things are, and things are cyclic, and we're not really the center of all things. And you know, that's what you got to do to ride the wave. Thoughts on Joseph de Maistre? Yeah, I like de Maistre. I think he's also a very underappreciated writer, especially the St. Petersburg dialogues and the what's it called? The Executioner. 2 really great books to read about and to like delve into his ability as a writer. Any advice for someone about to go through catechism and confirmation into Catholicism? Any tips on good reading prior to it, or any tips for finding a good church sponsor? As for a sponsor, I mean, I think a lot of people struggle with that now, because if you're new to the church, then you haven't been brought up in it. And if you've been brought up in it, it's, you know, you probably have family and friends who would be your sponsor. So just ask someone in the church, or just ask your priest. They'll probably find you someone. Any tips on good reading prior to it? Bishop Barron's book, Catholicism, is great. Any advice? Ask questions, take your time, and just don't put too much pressure on yourself when you're starting anew. Am I familiar with the work of Federico Campagna? I was meant to do an episode with Federico, and I actually sent him the questions, and he didn't get back to me, so I might have to look into that, but I am familiar with it, yeah. Do I think Land's idea of coldness, hotness can be reconciled with Pete's idea of metabolism and Vernadsky's idea of the biosphere? that's extremely specific. I would have to look into that. Will I read Horsley's new Kubrick book, or was your fallout with him too dramatic? I don't think the fallout was too dramatic. And I'd like to read his new book. He did include me when he sent out the press release. He included my email, so it was a long time ago as well. So yeah. Saeed Nizmuddin Ahmad on Evola and Gain On. Okay, look into that. Do you think the internet has been a net positive or a net negative? It's somewhere in the middle. Like any technology, it's our relationship to it which factors, whether or not it's a net positive or net negative. I mean, the notions of positive and negative are only really in relation to some sort of values that people hold. The reason I think the internet seems so bad is that if you don't have any values, then a sort of piece of technology like this is just going to completely throw everything out of whack, because you don't know where you're going to go with it. So what's made is just the lowest common denominator of content, basically. That's all the questions I've got from Patreon. I mean, if there's any more questions people want to ask, then please let me know. Otherwise, this has been a enjoyable birthday Q&A. Then I'm just going to go off and enjoy my evening. But it's always fun to do these Q&As. Am I familiar with Matthew Crawford? You would have a good chat about phenomenology and carpentry. I've heard the name. I go through these comments after the chat and end up bookmarking a ton of names and a ton of books and a ton of people to contact. So I will put that name down and look into it for you. Alright, well, if that's everything, then thanks everyone for coming along. It's been good fun, as usual. I'm looking to sort of do these Q&As more often, but yeah. Last final question. I don't use a smartphone. I use a very basic flip phone, and it hasn't really changed on my life all that much not having one. You just find other distractions, unfortunately. But yeah, thanks everyone for coming along. Please think about supporting the podcast. Thanks everyone for listening and watching and all of that. And yeah, thanks for coming along to this Q&A. See you guys.